Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Carolina von Schantz. I work at Sida, and I will facilitate this seminar and discussion about resilience in Ukraine. With me on stage, I have Tobias Tyberg, Sweden's ambassador to Ukraine. Welcome.
Thank you.
I have Maria Tishenko, the founder and director of the NGO Poruch. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Susanna Dellans, Deputy Head of Corporation at the Swedish Embassy in Kiev. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
The title of this discussion and seminar is Resilience in Ukraine, How Sweden Has Supported Increased Democracy and Decentralization. And we will talk about this in the light of Russia's aggression towards Ukraine. Sweden has been a partner to Ukraine since the 90s, and we have been a supporter of the integration of Ukraine in EU. With the full-scale invasion in February 2022, we, Sida, had to adopt our support to Ukraine to meet new needs. The humanitarian support was planned to be 32 million Swedish kroners, but after the invasion, it grew to 545 million Swedish kroners in 2022. And currently, this year, the support is 220 million Swedish kroners. And our humanitarian support has included cash support, shelter, food, water, basic hygiene products, restoration of water and energy systems, and so on. But, as I said, we have worked with Ukraine for a long time. We have worked with projects, contributions, initiatives, reforms, and this work could not stop in February 2022. We had to continue. And one area that turned out to be essential and a cornerstone in terms for the resilience, that was something called decentralization, the decentralization reform. And I'm not sure if this is a familiar term to everyone. So I would like to turn to you, Tobias. Maybe you can explain a little bit what decentralization is, why it was needed, and maybe also the history.
There's another word that I prefer to use rather than decentralization, and it's local self-government, because I think that explains more exactly what we're talking about. It's simply the idea that political democratic decisions should be taken as close as possible to the people who are directly affected by those decisions. It's really not more difficult than that. So if you think about the kind of role that Swedish municipalities, kommuner, that they have in Swedish democratic decision-making, that is exactly what we're talking about. Then there are many different nuances, but none of that is terribly important. The main idea is that municipalities should make a lot of decisions. Now, historically speaking, I think one of the things that's very important to bear in mind about Ukraine is that there is a very deep democratic DNA in the Ukrainian society, the way I see it. Despite 350 years of Russian colonization, Russia never managed to really dislodge that sort of deep sense of community organization and community decision-making in Ukraine. Horizontal decision-making, horizontal networks have always been extremely important in Ukraine, and we saw the explosive positive power of that back in 2014 in the response to Russia's attempt to sort of recolonize Ukraine back then. And we've seen it even more so in response to the full-scale Russian invasion since February 2022. So the idea of locally empowered citizens who make decisions for the benefit of their own communities is something which is deeply embedded in Ukrainian society. At least that's my impression. And I'll be happy to be contradicted on that. Now, of course, first Russian imperial colonial rule, followed by Soviet colonial rule over Ukraine, has tried to diminish that. The Soviet Union and the Russian Empire before were extremely centralized structures, and they tried to wipe out this element of local, shall we say, proto-democracy in Ukrainian society. And I think one of the reasons why Ukraine has been so spectacularly successful, not only in response to this full-scale invasion, but also more widely in its development as an independent state, is because it has those deep roots of pluralism, of community organization, of horizontal networks. We've seen them in action not only in the last 16 months, but frankly in the last 30 years in many different ways. And those are the kinds of structures that Sweden believes that it's very important to strengthen and to sort of wrench them away from the terrible, destructive legacy of Russian colonialism. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So if I've understood it right, this was about shifting power from a central position down to people.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess any local self-government is essentially about ensuring that there's a lot of democratic decision-making taken on the community level. So yes, I mean, shifting power, if you will, yeah.
Thank you. I will quickly turn to Susanna. You were based both in Kiev and in Stockholm. You have been working in and with Ukraine for at least 2 decades, if I've understood it right. And you have been working with decentralization and reforms. Could you just quickly give me some numbers? What has the consequence been working with the decentralization reforms?
Yeah, just to put us all on the same map and to understand where we are now, I think there have been several attempts to decentralize the Ukrainian governance system since independence. But the one that we are talking about now, the decentralization reform, really got its spark from the revolution of dignity in 2013, 2014. And since then, since 2015, there has been a voluntary amalgamation of settlements because the task was really to redraw the map of Ukraine. So we are talking about some 12,000 settlements, cities and villages that amalgamated. They joined together to form municipalities, what in Ukrainian is called hromada. And this was very successful. There was a huge movement in all regions of the country, and in October 2020, the current setup was formed with 1,469 municipalities, nearly 1,500. And just for a Swedish audience to understand it, they are very similar to Swedish kommun. So, yeah. So we have hromada, which is the local self-government. And then we also have the state represented on regional level, on the oblast, and the districts, but they are sort of less importance in what we see as the future of Ukraine.
Thank you. Now I will turn to you, Maria. You're from Ukraine.
Yes.
You live here today. You live in Malmö, where you're an associate professor at Malmö University. You're the director and founder of a Ukrainian NGO called Poruch. And as I understood, you founded it in 2011 to promote volunteer program and developing civil society. You have seen with your own eyes the fast development of municipalities in Ukraine. I'm really curious if you could tell us all in what concrete ways local self-governance really made a difference in people's daily lives. Please.
Thank you so much. So halfly I live in Sweden, halfly in Ukraine, so I commute home very often because we continue implementation of different democratic instruments in Ukraine. This is participatory budgeting. This is school participatory budgeting. This is different public consultation, public hearing. So we still, continue our democratic way which we choose. And probably my organization, we are example of democracy on local level because we cooperate with local authorities, with central government, and we develop our communities, empower citizens, and it's of course on research-based solutions. So we understand people needs. And also reflect on the all stages of the war, because actually invasion started in 2014. So our organization, we're in Donetsk and Lugansk region, working with communities and help in all stages, so emergency and stabilization and development. So we know how to work with communities. And of course, and as a mentor of ICLD, we work on municipal programs, and already we have cooperation with Swedish municipalities, Swedish-Ukrainian municipalities, and our programs based on also on human rights. And we implement change projects based on accountability, gender equality, accessibility. So this is combination of instruments which we use in our communities. And the most important, I just want to tell about Susanna's work in Ukraine, because it's amazing. We created 600 administrative service centers in Ukraine. And this is the hearts of communities. So even nowadays, they play huge role, because these administrative service centers, they become humanitarian hubs in Ukraine right now. And this is channel of communication between citizen, local authorities, central government. So it's and it's influence to the life of the people so much, because you can get any service in the center of community, in administrative service center. You can receive any services. And even during all this full-scale invasion, we never lost connection with our digital services. So we also can share this experience with Swedish municipalities.
Can you just give an example of a service that can be given? Give it like a concrete example.
A concrete example, you know that today we have internally displaced people who just lost their houses in my native city, Kakhovka, Kherson region. They just, lost all documents, and in 1 minute, you can receive any document in administrative service center. So it's accessible, and you have all needed documents. You can receive any support. This is also services of social services, so any document. So concrete example of decentralization.
Exactly. Do you have anything to add there, Susanna, about services? Do you have any other examples?
Well, maybe to explain the difference, because before we could decentralize this service provision, people had to travel very far.
That's a good
You
example.
may have to travel 140 kilometers to renew your passport, or 200 kilometers to receive a death certificate. So this has really brought the services closer to where people live, where people work.
Another concrete example. So we have talked a little bit about the history of decentralization and what that has meant. And if we again put it in the light of the war, of Russia's aggression, I've heard you actually talked about the impact that this reform has had. You spoke about the first chaotic days of the war and the roles of municipalities. Can you tell us a little bit more? I know you have a specific example.
Yeah. If you permit, I'd like to, say something about the very beginning of the full-scale invasion back in February 2022, and also what we see happening now in the context of your question. So, I think it's important to recall what a shock the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022 was. And I'm firmly convinced that in those critical days, the first week, the first 2 weeks, certain things happened which, if they would not have happened, things would have turned out very differently and much worse for Ukraine. It took several days for the full state machinery to get its act together and to organize the full centralized military response to the war. These things, you know, don't happen by miracle. I mean, it's even when a country is invaded, it takes time for the machinery of the state to get its act together. And it went extremely quickly in Ukraine. It was incredibly fast, but it did take some time. It did take a few weeks. And I think that in those crucial, critical days in the beginning of the war, individual people and individual communities in Ukraine did things which were absolutely crucial. And I just mentioned a couple of examples. There was one municipality close to Kiev called Demidov, I believe, where the municipality essentially decided that we will detonate a flodvall. I don't know what you call it.
A river barrier.
Yeah. Flood our entire town in order to stop the Russian advance. So just imagine, just put yourself in the position of a small town in northern Ukraine whose citizens are much, much poorer and have much fewer material means than any Swede, who decide that we will now destroy everything we have in order to stop the Russians. And this is something which requires a hugely developed level of, empowerment. This is not something you do if what you're used to is sitting and waiting from the phone call from Kiev or from Moscow for somebody to tell you what to do. So this is one example. Another example is the town of Akhtirka in Kharkiv region, which is a bit further to the east, where there was a tiny garrison of soldiers, and the municipal bosses basically went to the soldiers and said, okay, we don't have enough military means to stop the Russians. We have to organize a citizens' militia. And within literally 24 hours, they managed to mobilize a local army of 1,000 volunteers with no military equipment. They were just given guns, and they stopped the Russian advance. This type of local initiative, I might be wrong, but my guess is that this would not have been possible if Ukraine would have had a Soviet mindset, where all you do is sit and wait for the instructions to come from above. This is something which requires a habit of empowerment and a habit of communal decision-making. So that's from the first few days of the war. And with your permission, I just wanted to bring us forward, because that's looking back. But if we look towards the future, and I think what you said was, resonates very much with that. When I travel in Ukrainian regions, when I go to communities close to the front, when I go to places where the humanitarian needs are staggering, it's really interesting to watch the dynamic between the representatives of Kiev, who are the regional governors in the oblast. Oblast, you could compare it to a Swedish län. And the governor is essentially appointed by the central power. So Zelensky says, okay, you, Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so, will be the governor of Kherson Oblast, for instance, and then there's a bunch of municipalities. Now, when this governor, who often comes from another part of Ukraine, when she or he goes out into those communities who are suffering under, tremendous humanitarian strain from the consequences of Russia's invasion, they're essentially blind when they come to these communities, because they have a bag of money from the UN or from the Ukrainian state or from the ICRC or whatever. They have some means, but they have no idea how to prioritize it. All they know is that there's no way that this money is going to be enough to address all the needs. So where do we even start? And what I see over and over and over again is that the crucial relationship in that humanitarian delivery is the relationship between the regional governor who's been appointed by the central government and the municipal decision makers who have been elected by their own voters. Because those people in the field, they know exactly that if we have $100, this is how we need to prioritize them. Yes, it's really important to do this at the school, but it's even more important to do this with this bridge, because if you don't do that, then the kids won't even be able to come to the school. For example, I mean, whatever it is. And so what I see over and over again is that there's an extremely trustful and close relationship between these regional governors appointed by the central government and the local decision makers elected by the people in the field. And I think without that connection, the money that countries like Sweden put into Ukraine wouldn't be even half as effective. So I think this is also important for us as Swedish taxpayers to understand, is that these kinds of reforms, which is strengthening local self-government in Ukraine, is also a way of ensuring that the machinery is there to make sure that the resources that countries like Sweden send to Ukraine are used as effectively as possible. So sorry,
No worries.
being lengthy.
We still have time. We already mentioned a little bit that one consequence of the war is that a lot of people flee from they left their homes. And I read that more than 5 million people are internal refugees. And I've understood that the municipalities have a really clear role in receiving all of these people. Maybe Susanna, you can start and elaborate a little bit about how this has worked.
Sure, I can start and then Maria will help me. Yes, of course, 5 million refugees within one country. I think the biggest recipient of refugees is Dnipro, which is a city still in the east of Ukraine. So we know that when people flee, they don't flee very far. And we also know that those who flee are those who have the resources to do so. So the most vulnerable population stays behind. But so the receiving municipalities, of course, provide housing. They ensure that the internally displaced persons receive state subsidies, and they organize sort of the lives of these newcomers. And if they are staying for a longer term, it's also about finding employment possibilities for them. And here again, the administrative service centers that Maria talked about, that Sweden has helped supporting, has played a crucial role to mobilize support for the internal refugees and to housing and all what is needed for that. So we know all these examples where they have made available schools and public buildings for housing and so on. So they have played a crucial role for sure. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And as NGO, we reflect immediately, and second day of the full-scale invasion, we begin evacuating people and abroad to our partner organizations. So we evacuated more than 300 families with children, and we start online. It was not education, but it was so-called school. Because we read books for children who were sitting in the shelters, because we found that they need this psychological support. So through psychological support with books, with reading, we support vulnerable groups of people. And for example, in Mykolaiv region, we organized a humanitarian hub. And what is important, we help vulnerable group of people. So we provide financial support during 2022 to vulnerable group of people, and it was extremely dangerous. And we have 38 people on bicycles who were actually traveling along the front line to get support to vulnerable group. Children with disabilities, people with disabilities. And our team evacuated 42 people with disabilities from Kharkiv to Malmö, and to, to the city which accept very difficult cases, and people were integrated to this community. And actually, due to Swedish examples, we implement new building norms in Ukraine. And as to the IDPs, internally displaced people, each community faces with this challenge. But a lot of communities use this as human resource, as human capital. And these people who came from big cities, they can do input to small communities. They develop their communities economically, also institutionally. So this is not a problem. This is really good, solution of a lot of problems, local problems. Because in a lot of our communities, we still have working small enterprises. This is 1, 2, 3 people, but it's still working. And this is important to strengthen economically our communities.
Fantastic example. It's a new reality now. Martial laws has been introduced, and I think this is interesting because maybe this is affecting the democracy. I'm not sure. Can you, Tobias, elaborate a little bit? What's the consequences of martial laws?
It's a difficult topic. I mean, the first and most important thing I want to say on this topic is that martial law is absolutely necessary. And the reason why I say this is because obviously martial law comes with a cost. Martial law, by definition, is a limitation of the existing constitution, right? And it is, frankly, a reduction of democracy. That is what martial law is. So I think the first important thing to say is that in a time of war, it is absolutely crucial to introduce martial law. Now, having said that, since martial law does represent a limitation of democracy, it does come with certain risks. I sometimes compare it to chemotherapy. I mean, it's necessary to save the life of a cancer patient, but of course, it also damages the organism. So it's something which one has to relate to, very carefully over time. I wouldn't say that the introduction of martial law in and of itself damages the development of local self-governance in Ukraine. But what I will say is that in an atmosphere of war and in a time of extreme national crisis and stress, there is probably a natural tendency in the central government, maybe, to control. And this tendency, as natural as it is something which we need to relate to over time. And it's something which countries like Sweden and other like-minded partners of ours have an ongoing dialogue about with the central Ukrainian government. Essentially, to put it in very basic terms, the message is, yes, we get it, you have to do this, but please do not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Now, my experience during the last 16 months of this war, and that's of course only my individual experiences, and I'm sure others might disagree with me, but my experience has been that over the course of these 16 months of full-scale Russian invasion, there has been a positive development in the central government of Ukraine in terms of understanding why we cannot survive without our strong, empowered municipalities. And I think the example that I mentioned previously about the relationship between the governors and the municipal leaders is an illustration of that. So I'm fundamentally not too worried. I'm fundamentally optimistic. But yes, we have to keep an eye on the risk that you're alluding to.
Thank you. Maria would like to add something regarding the Marshall.
Yes, I just would like to tell example that as a civil society organization, we implement gender policy in Ministry of Regional Development before it integrated with Ministry of Infrastructure. We implemented gender policy in energy security, and now we continue implementation on Resolution 3025 and organize localization and implementation on local level. So I don't feel barriers between, central government, local authorities, and us as civil society activists. I don't feel these barriers. So we implement our policy, what we want, so together. So it doesn't mean someone just tell us what to do. No, this is need from the fields. So this is need when we cover needs of people on local level. We hide these problems and can do institutional changes in central policy. So I think, just imagine how you can stop a civil society movement when you have all country volunteers.
Yeah.
True. If
Can I just add?
Yes, please.
Because I think a challenge here is also the novelty of this new governance system. So as I mentioned, this map of Ukraine that we have today with 1,469 Hromadas, it's only been real since October 2020, during the pandemic. So it's also a new way of thinking, and it takes some time to acknowledge this new level of self-governance. So that is a challenge, but I'm also optimistic.
I'm thinking about, we have time and I have more questions, but I'm just thinking if we might have a question from the audience, I could let that in. Is there anybody? Otherwise you can think about, oh, we have a question. Please, hi.
Hello, my name is Måns Bolander from Human Rights Watch. I have a more forward-oriented question about building back better, and if you have any thoughts on how we can make sure that when reconstruction is happening, that we have a right respecting reconstruction. And for example, I can take the example of children in institutions, an issue that we've been working on. We have 105,000 children in institutions that were sent back home or to wherever they could find a caretaker in 24th of February last year. How can we make sure that they are not sent back to institutions, but create something that is more child-friendly and community care institutions or things like that? But generally, how can we ensure that?
Thank you. Who wants to answer?
Can I, please? So I just will also give example. During full-scale invasion, our organization opened 8 new schools of peace. And this is accessible schools, and this is schools which include children with disabilities, IDP children, and so on. But we have already gender policy also, so to build back better will account all needs of people. So this will be accessible, this will be with gender perspective, and of course account needs of vulnerable group of people, because unfortunately amount of people with disabilities increase each day. And actually Sweden is responsible for my region, my Kherson region, and I hope we can do changes in also in local level. And actually we have new building norms, and so these cities will be accessible and accessible. So
We actually have another question, or did you want to comment?
Just a very brief comment. I think it's an extremely important question. The question is so large that I think it'll only be possible today to make some small reflections in response to it. But I think 2 things that I'd like to add to what Maria said. Number one is, I think the most important way to ensure a rights-based perspective to reconstruction is to make sure that citizens are involved in reconstruction decisions. And I think the best way of ensuring that is to ensure that you have a strong role of democratically legitimate municipalities in that decision-making structure. So I think that's why there's a very strong link between today's topic, local self-governance, and rights-based reconstruction. The second element, which I think is going to be extremely important, is the EU accession process, because that is going to give Ukraine extremely strong incentives to carry out reforms, which in an environment without the promise of future EU accession might feel, okay, this is important, but we just can't take this burden upon ourselves now. It's just a bit too much in the current context to also think about, these several issues. So I think with that sort of bottom-up and top-down perspective, so bottom-up, empowered municipalities, and top-down, a very strong reform incentive on the part of the central government, I think those will be two very important elements towards that important goal that you bring up.
Thank you. I think we will let it.
Thank you.
Please.
Very interesting panel and very interesting your perspectives. Thank you so much. My name is Anastasia Klonova and I'm working for Beredskapslyftet in Sweden. It's a skill shift initiative where we work with helping Ukrainians who came here due to the war to come very quick into the work. And we are discussing very much the process of rebuilding of Ukraine and the dual training part. So I would really like to hear your points of view. What is dual training? It's basically that people who came here to Sweden that are extremely well educated and have very different profiles, how we can skill them with the needed knowledge and skills that would be both maybe useful right now in Sweden, but also could be used with the time when they're coming back, when we are up for the rebuilding of Ukraine. And would be really interesting a bit from your different perspectives of you're from civil society, maybe a very concrete one that would really help. One of the example, just to bring the thought in, is, for example, there are many doctors who are now in Sweden due to the families in east of Ukraine, and for example, discussing and thinking about educating them in rehabilitation techniques so they could help with rehabilitation of Ukrainian soldiers. Something like this, like very concrete, would be very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like?
We're now sort of on the Swedish turf, and we know the Ukrainian turf best, I think. But what you raise is so important. And because we're also thinking ahead, we're thinking about Ukraine's victory, and we're thinking about the returns of Ukrainians to their homeland. So this is definitely something to follow up. And I'm thinking, I don't have any examples, but now I'm fantasizing. Because, I think we talk about restoring or reconstructing or rebuilding Ukraine better, building back better. And we all understand that it's going to take a lot of resources. And I'm from Sida, and of course our funds will not reach very far. So we are talking about using the whole Swedish resource base. And I think key actors within the Swedish resource base are the Swedish communes, so the Swedish municipalities, and perhaps, there could be initiatives on the municipal level, and also integrate and be in contact, if you are Ukrainian in Sweden, to remain in contact with your home municipality. I mean, that's one possible way forward, I think.
Thanks. I think we have time for. We have another question there. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for this great initiative. I'm coming from a small organization called Operation Aid, and we've been in Ukraine for a while. But what's happening now, it's like big companies in Sweden who want to help Ukraine with both rebuilding, but I think it would be good to also have some forum to help them to reach out to Ukraine. Two examples is SSAB, who donated, I think, 10,000 of square meters of roof materials, and it was a huge thing for us alone to try or to make them put up on houses. And also now we have a different for them or to take away explode ammunition. And also they want to help and put their products in Ukraine. But I think we, as a small organization as us, it's hard for us to alone help them to have their products or these Swedish products. Is it any way to get governmental funds or some other forum to make it together with and help Swedish companies get their products which are badly needed in Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you. It's maybe kind of outside this topic, but
the only thing I want to say, it's so important what you're saying. You're so right, and it's a really big need, and it's a very good suggestion. There is, I mean, coordination is hell, as we all know, and there is a very big need of exactly what you're talking about. So I can only sort of really second what you're saying, that if there were a structured platform for helping, what the private sector is willing to contribute with the needs of Ukraine, if such a platform were there, it would be a really, really good thing. So yeah, worth taking forward is all I can say right now.
Thank you.
And can we add that Business Sweden is opening offices in Kyiv, so we hope that within this year there will already be a platform that can support Ukraine.
And frankly, that would be probably the best thing that they could do in the short term.
Yeah.
Frankly. Yeah. And they get money from the government, so they should do something with that money. So, good idea.
Can I add, please, to previous question, because I think it's very important that we also, as Ukrainians, can teach a lot of things. Swedish society. We have different democratic instruments which not appear in Sweden. We have really good digital services. We have really good cybersecurity defense. So we can also give, something to society and to do input to Swedish society. It's not only asking for help. It's also we would like to give, and we have what to give. We have really amazing youth policy. We have youth council. We have youth centers. We can implement advisory bodies like youth councils or just civil society councils. And a lot of things we can also teach. And months ago, we organized a round table with our decision makers in Stockholm on cooperation, on rehabilitation of our people. And already 80 soldiers receive rehabilitation in Sweden. So this is maybe practice which Swedish doctors didn't have before, because this is very hard cases which they receive. So I think we can, vice versa, work to give, and you can also study how to protect your communities, how to mobilize your communities, how to empower your communities, and maybe to empower also youth initiatives on local level, to create maybe a volunteer network in communities like we are doing in Ukraine.
That's extremely important what you're saying, and I can just sort of, as an example, say that when we've had, for instance, Swedish government officials visiting Ukraine during the course of these last 16 months, and they talk to Ukrainian counterparts about the kind of things that Ukrainian society has done in response to this war, their jaw really drops. I mean, they're like, we had the new Minister for Civil Defense, Carl-Oskar Bolin, who was in Ukraine recently. We had the Senior State Secretary from the Ministry of Defense, who was down in Mykolaiv and Kherson, and talking about the sort of the total defense of Ukrainian society against the Russian aggression down there. And the kind of stuff that they heard, they were like, is this even possible? Can people do this? So I think what you're saying is really, really important. And I think it's very, very important now that countries like Sweden seize this opportunity to learn from what Ukraine has developed in these last 16 months, because it's really quite miraculous. So just, to really second that point.
That was great, because that was one of my final questions, if you had any advice to Sweden. So yes, you have, and that's really great. We have one more minute, so I would actually a little bit think about talk about quickly what's happening now. How is Sweden's support going to look like? And I think I have to ask you, Susanna, to. Please.
Yes, it is a big question. We are anticipating a new bilateral strategy for cooperation with Ukraine. I'm now talking about the reform cooperation that we do, which will also include reconstruction and recovery. So we will continue within that. If I were to talk about decentralization, we will continue supporting fiscal decentralization, decentralization of education, and continue supporting administrative service provision on the local level. But also what will be key here will be the municipal partnerships. I mean, bringing in Swedish municipalities to cooperate directly with Ukrainian.
Perfect. So time is up. Thank you.
Thank you
for listening, and thank you to the audience on YouTube.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.